Hello and welcome to our webinar, English as a Lingua Franca. This webinar is being held in the context of the virtual week of master's programs here at Universidad ICESI. Today, we will have a short conference with Dr. Tim Marr. He is a PhD in applied linguistics from a university in London, and he is also a visiting professor here at our university. He teaches every year some of the courses in our master's program. He is also a teacher trainer and consultant for Liverpool University in China. Additional to this, he is the author of two books, Why Do Linguistics and Rethinking TESOL in Global Settings. Today, he will talk to us about English as a lingua franca. This is a very important topic for English teachers all over the world. Thank you, Dr. Marr, for being here.
Okay, here's a question. When you think of English speakers, who do you think of? I'm guessing you probably think of people who look a bit like this. They're probably American, they're certainly Western, they're certainly white. Of course, lots of other people speak English, but when you first think of English speakers, lots of people usually think of people who look a bit like this. So it's a kind of stereotype about English speakers. And this stereotype is carried over into course books as well. If you look at the covers of these two course books that I've put up here on the slides, look at the first one. It says Talking English, and then in smaller letters, Conversational American English. And look at the faces of the people on the cover of this course book. Again, they're virtually all white, they're virtually all Western, they look very American, there's very little diversity. In the second course book cover that you can see there, this course book is actually called Talking with Americans. Look at the picture. Which of those two people, which do you think is probably the American? Is it the black guy or is it the white guy? Obviously, it could be either, but I'm guessing that most people are going to think it's the white Western-looking guy who is the American native speaker. When there is diversity in English teaching materials, quite often the diversity only takes the form of pointing out these rather obvious and rather superficial differences between British English and American English. Beyond that, there is not much recognition, really, of who speaks English in the world. So this brings me to my second question. Who really does speak English in the world? In terms of native speakers, let's just take a look at some numbers. English might be the world's global language, yes, but in terms of native speakers, no, it's not. Here are my figures. If you look at Putonghua, also known rather slightly inaccurately as Mandarin, probably about 1 billion native speakers. Spanish, way more than English, again, probably something like 460, maybe 480 million native speakers. Compared with that, English only has about 380, maybe 400 million native speakers. So by no means is English the language with the most native speakers in the world. However, here's the thing. How many non-native speakers does Putonghua? How many non-native speakers does Spanish have? How many non-native speakers do Hindi and Urdu have, for example? Relatively speaking, very few. But look at my next figures here. This is the key figure. The number of non-native speakers of English is at least another billion people, and it's growing fast. What that means is that for every native speaker of English, there are 3 or 4 non-native speakers. And therefore, in the world as a whole, amongst English users, native speakers are a minority, and a small minority, maybe 25% of all the users of English. And this means that the characteristic pattern of global English is a very distinct one. It's quite different from other languages. Sure, we have native speaking to native, and sure, we have native speaking to non-native, and that would be just the same for Chinese or Spanish or Hindi, Urdu. But for English, the primary pattern of communication is between non-native speakers and non-native speakers. Native speakers are just not involved. That is to say, the primary role of English is as the global lingua franca. What we call the world's second language is predominantly used between non-native speakers of the language. And in that sense, English is unlike any other language. Now, what does this imply for teachers of English? It implies that we need to move the focus away from the native speaker, and particularly move the focus away from these stereotyped or idealized native speakers who are all Western and who are all white and who look a bit like me, for example. But even here, and I'm talking to you from my house in London, even here in my street, probably 80% of the people in the street are non-native speakers of English. And that means that the English is being used as a lingua franca right here in the capital of England. It's the same pattern in Manchester, it's the same pattern in Los Angeles, in New York, in Sydney, in Toronto. Lingua franca English is a reality even in supposedly English-speaking countries. Now, think about your teaching materials as a teacher of English. Do your teaching materials actually reflect this reality? Do they reflect the reality of how English is used and who uses it? Do you tell your students how English works in the world? Or do you just leave them to assume that when we say English speakers, we're thinking of North Americans, we're thinking of Brits? A more complicated question, are you preparing your learners to deal with English as it is used in the world today? Or are they only getting used to dealing with native speaking, maybe American models of English? Do you use a variety of models of English in your classroom? That is to say, are you exposing your students to a variety of accents and dialects of English, both native and non-native? Because that is the reality of how English is used. I say again, native speakers in global use of English are a minority. Your students should not be expecting that when they speak English, they will be speaking to native speakers of English. Statistically, they probably will not be. This leads to another question. Do you have a clear focus on intelligibility and comprehensibility when you are teaching your students to speak English and to listen to English? Or are you showing them only native speaker models? Are you teaching your students to use correct grammatical form, which is a great thing, of course, but are you only teaching them to use correct grammatical form? Because you should also be thinking about teaching them how to communicate, how to listen for meaning, how to negotiate meaning, how to co-construct conversations with other speakers who might not be native speakers of English. And therefore, my last question for now, are you teaching them to communicate intercultural? Are you giving them some exposure to the variety of cultures that are reflected and mediated through the English language? Or are you lazily assuming that Americans and Brits and Australians are the only cultures who own English? Here at ISESI, in our MA TEFL program, we try and bring these questions to the fore in everything that we teach. We try and produce alumni who will be highly skilled teachers of English, and they will understand how English is used in the world today, not how it was used 100 years ago. We aim to produce alumni who have the linguistic and the sociolinguistic skills to embrace how English is actually used in the world today. And also, of course, the technical, and the intercultural, and the pedagogical skills. And with all this, we think that we produce alumni who will have the vision and the ability and the skills to go back to their institutions and position themselves there as academic leaders. That's what we want, to produce linguists who are academic leaders in their institutions. And I do hope you'll come and join us.
Thank you very much for having connected with us. I invite you to join to our master's program. You can contact me at my email address dmdiaz@isesi.edu.co. Thank you very much and see you soon.